Well, our sermon today is going to come from Acts chapter 5, beginning in verse 17. Have you ever wondered why God sometimes does a miraculous deliverance, and other time God seems to be absolutely nowhere to be found, and you sort of feel like you're plodding through adversity all alone? One of my favorite Facebook posts of all time was a cartoon that has a cartoon of Jesus answering the question of where were you to a guy who is tearfully pointing to one set of footprints in the sand. This guy felt like he was walking through life alone, and Jesus said, "The one set of footprints was when I carried you." And then Jesus in this cartoon points off to the other side, and he says, "And that long groove over there was where I dragged you for a while." But this idea that you would be kicking and screaming all the way, and this notion is quite familiar to me, of that idea of kicking and screaming all the way. Can anyone other than me relate to that one? I don't know. So today we'll look at 3 ways that God is there to deal with opposition for us. Sometimes he carries us, sometimes he drags us through, and sometimes, like today, there is a miraculous deliverance. In our case today, it's actually a jailbreak. But there's no kicking and screaming being done by Peter and John in today's passage, and yet God does carry them through this miraculous delivery, this jailbreak. The scene sort of begins, taking on from last week, in the public square where the apostles have been doing all kinds of teaching, all kinds of miraculous demonstrations of power as the pure church, the powerful church, and they become the growing church. And that's what we talked about last week. And all this growing gets noticed. And it makes the religious leaders, the high priest, his co-workers, and all the Sadducees, it makes them really, really jealous. You may remember the pattern from last week was pure church, powerful church, growing church, and that leads us to the persecuted church, which is what we see again this week. It's a cycle. Jealousy is but one reason that opposition happens. And I've been thinking a lot this week about the concept of opposition that is arising really around the globe against Christians and against Jews because of our mutual belief that the Messiah is a Jewish one. Opposition to us arises out of jealousy, yes, but it also arises out of hatred and out of pride, small but evil gods of self, as well as some people's wholehearted devotion to the wrong God. Maybe you've wondered some of the same things that I have regarding that fanatical fringe of Islam that has been doing all the recent atrocities. What must they believe? What kind of God of Islam would demand that people convert or be murdered in all kinds of atrocious ways? What kind of God of Islam would command his followers to gain converts or adherents by intimidation, or if they won't behave, kill them? It's like from Star Wars, where that Governor Tarkin answers the question of how they're going to maintain control without the bureaucracy by saying, "Fear will keep the local systems in line, fear of this battle station." Or like Darth Vader, after doing that strangulation move, says, "Apology accepted, Captain Nita." What kind of God of Islam would be honored at his followers purging the world of infidels, instead of trying to share maybe good news that might save them? Why would anybody worship a God that believes primarily in getting people to convert or be killed? It's a spiritual bully, a gang enforcer type of God, a serial killer kind of God. But that is clearly what the fanatical fringe among Islam believes. And frankly, I don't get it. In today's passage, however, the opposition is rooted in jealousy. It's a powerful motivator, appealing to the human desires of pride and of selfishness. Jealousy makes people do really bad things. Even the Jewish spiritual leaders of that day weren't exempt from it. They see this growing and powerful church, and so what does opposition do? They counter the spiritual power of the growing church with human power, which takes the form of persecuting jail time, beatings, financial punishment, threats, intimidation, all the way up to killing, just as it did with Christ, who paved the way for us. So in Acts chapter 5, beginning in verse 17, it says, "Then the high priest and all of his associates, who were members of the party of the Sadducees, were filled with jealousy. They arrested the apostles and they put them in the public jail." So the disciples, they're in prison. The last time they were in prison, they got chewed out and told not to do it anymore, but this time the consequences are a bit worse, as that cycle of persecution kind of intensifies. This time, they're going to be charged officially in front of the entire Sanhedrin. But God had something else in mind. Our passage continues in verse 19, and it says, "But during the night an angel of the Lord opened the doors of the jail and brought them out." Kind of reminds me of that scene from the movie The Santa Claus, in which the ELFS, the Effective Liberating Flight Squad of little elves, takes curling ribbon and they tie up the guard, and then they use tinsel to cut through the hinges in order to liberate Santa. And they say tinsel, not just for decorating. Well, there's no evidence that the angel in this case used tinsel. There is no evidence that the angel used anything at all. It was just God's power to deliver these disciples out of prison, a jailbreak. It's really pretty incredible if you stop to think about it. The whole scene itself is really pretty interesting. There are a lot of jailbreaks and prison escapes that we see on TV and we read about in books and we see in the movies, Santa, but the movies like The Fugitive or Shawshank Redemption, Escape from Alcatraz, The Great Escape, Cool Hand Luke, The Count of Monte Cristo. And it's not always good guys getting out or those who have been unjustly imprisoned. Sometimes it's bad guys trying to break out of prison to do more bad things. Bad guys like that guy in Paris who radicalized at least one of the Charlie Hebdo killers. But in our case today, you know what? It's two good guys that God wanted back on duty. He was setting them free so they could get back to work. So the angel gives Peter and John these instructions. In verse 20, he says, "Go, stand in the temple courts," he said, "and tell the people the full message of this new life." Don't hide. Stand in the most public place you can find. Don't compromise, don't cut short, don't whitewash or gloss over anything, don't do it in secret, don't do it in a whisper. Proclaim it publicly. I'd like to take a bit of a time out and make something very clear. Not all of us have been created to be the kind of evangelists that Peter and John were. Not all of us are going to proclaim in such a way that we're going to end up in prison, freed by angels, and show up in the public square to do it all over again. But each of us has opportunities that God presents to us, and one of the reasons why I will frequently bring up items that are in the news or contemporary issues is because I want to teach you by way of example that there are ways that we can approach the gospel with our friends, with our neighbors, with our families, with our coworkers, without necessarily driving the entire gospel dump truck up to them and then dumping it on them. We don't have to do it that way. But when we hear about what's going on over in Europe with the infiltration of tons and tons and tons of Muslims, not all of whom are extremists, let's be clear about that, but they're reproducing faster than the white secularists in France and in Europe. Conquest doesn't always happen to be at the edge of a sword. It can sometimes be in sheer numbers. Something to think about. And so as Christians, as people who love a Jewish Messiah, we need to be looking out at the Jews that are being harmed in other areas of the world and say, you know what? These are Jesus' brothers and sisters in terms of racial genetics. We need to have a heart for them. And by bringing up these contemporary issues, my hope is that each of us will see that there are ways that God opens doors of opportunity for us to be able to minister to people and to be able to bring the gospel forward without necessarily being up in people's faces about it. But the angel to Peter and John, he says, "Go, stand in the temple courts, tell the people this full message of this new life." And that kind of bold witness is something that we've seen in Acts before, and it was characteristic of the early church. And it's how God grew the church from this tiny little band of ragtag, unschooled, ordinary people into an international phenomenon that has been growing for almost 2,000 years. All started with a couple of guys being willing to tell the people the full message of new life. Verse 21 says that at daybreak, Peter and John entered the temple courts as they had been told, and they began to teach the people. Obedience to God characterizes these disciples. They didn't hem and haw, they didn't delay, they didn't say they had to go wash their hair. They didn't debate with the angel for a while about whether this was really going to work. They didn't offer alternatives that maybe the angel needed to reconsider, reminding the angel and reminding God about how the last time they did this, it got them in jail. There was no equivocation, as these fugitives probably still feared for their lives under opposition from the religious leaders. For them, there was no messing around when it came to obeying God. And you see, this is the power of teaching spiritual truths. It arouses the jealousy of those who don't like God and who don't like his truth. Simple obedience to God can result in unjust hatred by the world. Jesus told us this was going to happen. But we don't need to fear our God's instructions, because it's not like we're serving some God who's telling us to convert people at the point of a sword, the barrel of a gun, or the slice of a knife. We aren't armed like that. Our God is not a serial killer. What are you and I armed with when we go out into battle? We're armed with truth and good news of God's great love. We are armed with God's power in his truth, his power in his good news. So back to our story in Acts, the apostles have now gone at daybreak into this public place, and they're doing what they've been told not to do. It is civil disobedience, not that much different than what we heard about in our children's message this morning about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Civil disobedience is something that Christians are allowed to do. They went out into a public place, and they were defying the religious authorities, not by chanting words of violence or hatred, but just simply standing for something positive, the good news of great joy, the gospel of salvation in Jesus Christ. Our passage continues, when the high priest and his associates arrived, they called together the Sanhedrin, which is this body of people who are the elders of Israel. It says the full assembly of the elders of Israel, and they all sent to the jail for the apostles. They were ready to gather the apostles in and gather this full crowd of people around them, and by sheer numbers intimidate them with political power. We'll apply collective pressure and intimidate them to make them stop. Verse 22, but on arriving at the jail, the officers didn't find them there. So they went back and reported, we found the jail securely locked and the guards standing at the door, but when we opened them, we found no one inside. Isn't that interesting? The angel opened the door and let the disciples out, and I don't know how or when he locked it back up, or even if he had to lock it back up. This whole thing is really very interesting. It was a miraculous deliverance. The doors were locked. The guards never even saw them leave. Sometimes that's what God does, a miraculous deliverance. More than just one set of footprints carrying us over the worst of times. But at other times he carries us in other ways, and he'll hold our hand while we walk through adversity together. And true, sometimes he also drags us if we're either unwilling or simply can't do it of our own strength or will. Sometimes he'll do it out of necessity because there is no other way for him to accomplish his will than to drag us kicking and screaming, which I will be the first to admit that he has done that with me a time or two. I'm not particularly proud of that, but there have been times that I haven't caught on as to what's going on, and so kicking and screaming was the way that it happened. You see, sometimes God, with his full knowledge, may drag us because he knows that we'd do what we're told if we knew what he knows. I'm going to say that again because it's kind of confusing. God will do, because of his full knowledge, he may drag us because he knows that we would do what we're told if we knew what he knows. Like when he was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah because it was beyond redemption. It was so thoroughly evil, it had to go. It just had to go. In Genesis chapter 19, verse 10 and following, it says, but the men, and these are actually the angels that have come to visit Lot, they reached out and they pulled Lot back into the house and they shut the door. Then they struck the men who were outside of the house, the young and old with blindness, so they couldn't find the door. These two angels said to Lot, do you have anyone else here, sons-in-law, sons or daughters, anybody else in the city who belongs to you? Get them out of here because we're going to destroy this place. The outcry to the Lord against its people is so great that he has sent us to destroy it. So Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law, who were pledged to marry his daughters, and he said, hurry, get out of this place because the Lord is about to destroy the city. But his sons-in-law thought he was joking. With the coming of dawn, the angels urged Lot, saying, hurry, take your wife and your two daughters who are here, or you will be swept away when the city is punished. And when he hesitated, the men, these are the angels, grabbed his hand and the hands of his wife and his two daughters, and they led them safely out of the city, for the Lord was merciful to them. As that story continues, they flee to this neighboring town, and Lot's wife, she just can't help herself. She's got to take a look back and see what was going on, and she does, and she becomes a pillar of salt. That passage continues on in verse 27. It says, early the next morning, Abraham, who is one of our great patriarchs, he got up and returned to the place where he had stood before the Lord, and this is where he had been pleading for Lot's life, that Lot would be spared. Abraham looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah all the way to the land of the plain, and he saw dense smoke rising from the land like smoke from a furnace. So when God destroyed the cities of the plain, he remembered Abraham, and he brought Lot out of the catastrophe that overthrew the cities where Lot had lived. Sometimes God drags us kicking and screaming because we don't know what's good for us, because we don't know exactly what he knows. God is gracious to deliver us out of evil, to deliver us from evil, as we already prayed this morning. Do you ever stop to think about that? When we're praying for God to deliver us from evil, this is what we're talking about. You see, God knows the tipping point of no return for the hearts of those who hate him and will always hate him. He knows the point of required deliverance for those who love him, which is what he does in our Acts passage with Peter and John. They're out of prison, they're preaching the good news, the full message of new life in the public square, and a miraculous deliverance from prison was required in order for them to continue doing it. As our Acts passage continues in verse 24, it says, on hearing this report, the captain of the temple guard and the chief priests were puzzled, wondering what would come of this. Sometimes God delivers us through a miraculous means. And if you know Jesus as your Lord and Savior, you've already been delivered once through a miraculous means. Let me say that again because it's really important that we get this. If you know Jesus as your Lord and Savior, you've already been delivered once from sin to saved through a miraculous means, the blood of Christ. And on top of that, as a normal course of daily life, you know what? Sometimes he delivers us through average means, through medical treatments that will eradicate Oliver's cancer, or dietary choices that can keep us from diabetes or heart attacks. Maybe a series of events that cause the loss of one job where your work for God is done, so that he can deliver you into the next place of fruitful service. Maybe that average means will be a relocation that takes you out of a place of no return to a new place of promise, a promised land of sorts where he intends to bless you and to bless others. Maybe that average means is every bit as average as a really long stoplight or a freight train that you're sitting there getting frustrated about. But maybe that's the time delay that keeps you from being hit by a drunk driver, because God's not done with you yet. If we know what God knows, we would do what God asks us to do. And sometimes when we don't know, God steps in and helps us even through very average means. But Peter and John, they were delivered out of prison miraculously so they could get back to work for Jesus. That said, you know what? Sometimes we aren't delivered out, but are made stronger through the difficulties that we face. Maybe some of us are in difficult marriages. Maybe some of us have prodigal children who will break your hearts. Maybe some of us are in jobs that seem to go from bad to worse, and you wonder at times why God doesn't do something. The denomination that trained me at Trinity is called the Evangelical Free Church of America, and a few years back they went through a bit of a doctrinal change in their statement of faith on kind of what most people would view as being kind of an obscure plank from an average pew-sitter's perspective. They revisited their position on, big word warning, premillennialism, which is a big word that is associated with the end times. All wrapped up in that idea is something like the Left Behind movie, where in one chaotic moment, millions of people around the world suddenly disappear, leaving their clothes, their wedding rings, their eyeglasses, and shoes in a crumpled pile. The people in the church are raptured up. They disappear, and their clothes are all that are left behind. There are a bunch of naked people showing up in heaven. And it happens before a bunch of worse things than naked people happen here on earth in something called the Great Tribulation. That whole idea is that people are saved up and out before anything worse starts to happen. This view of rapture of believers is actually very common in the church worldwide. A lot of people believe it. It's even lauded by quite a few people. But you know what? I kind of think it's wishful thinking. A view that the church is somehow exempted from all the bad stuff that's going to happen. Because personally, I don't see it fitting the biblical pattern. So I'm actually kind of glad that the EFCA looked at that again. Because the biblical pattern is more often delivering people through something. Through the famine in Egypt by sending the Hebrew Joseph to be able to manage the years of plenty in preparation for enduring the famine. Delivering people through slavery, even the bricks without straw, the plagues, in order to be delivered by the Exodus. Delivering through the Red Sea, like we heard about in our scripture reading this morning, even though they were being chased by Pharaoh's chariots and great big armies that were very powerful. Delivering people through the wilderness with manna and quail, God's miraculous provision. Delivering people through the crucifixion of Christ, who endured the cross. He didn't escape it. He endured the cross, he experienced death, and he rose victorious. Peter and John were delivered out of prison only to find themselves in the next, we're going to see this happening over and over again, they're going to be back there again before we know it, proving the point that C.S. Lewis often makes, which is that hardship often prepares an ordinary person for an extraordinary destiny. So when we're not being delivered miraculously or even by an average means, our prayer should be that God will deliver us through it. That long groove while he drags us for a while, even kicking and screaming as we don't understand the whys. Our prayer should be that we'll trust him with our lives, knowing that we've already experienced that one miraculous deliverance from sin to saved by the blood of Christ. Our prayer should be focused on being obedient and faithful and willing to let the hardships that we face prepare us in our heavenward calling. As believers who have been miraculously delivered once, we can trust him with all those smaller deliverances, those footprints of us carrying us over difficulties, whether through average means of medicine or technology or even kicking and screaming. with his hand forcibly grabbing us and leading us to safety because he's merciful. Today's jailbreak is a reminder that where God calls, he also provides in whatever way is required, even as he propels us back to our post to do our duty in obedience to him. Sometimes he carries, sometimes he drags us, and sometimes he does it miraculously. Let's pray.